Welcome, class, to our final lecture. I want to start off by saying I've been impressed throughout this quarter at the level of discussion in the class and the high quality of papers that I've seen. Clark College is a two-philosopher faculty, myself and Chris Nelson, and we offer a range of different philosophy courses, and I'd love to have you in more of them. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions about a philosophy course offering in the upcoming term or in any future term. We'll end our class looking into the purpose of life as discussed by Karl Marx and Siddhartha Gautama, who is known as the founder of Buddhism. So let's start with Marx. Karl Marx and modern Marxists focus on exposing and critically analyzing ideology. You can think of ideology as like a pair of glasses. An ideology colors or shades the world we look at. Ideology dictates what is most important to us and what possibilities lie outside of us, what problems exist that we may or may not confront, and more. We typically aren't even aware of our ideological assumptions. Consider someone who, say, wore glasses from day one. The glasses would be so familiar that they would feel like they were part of their face, and this person likely wouldn't even know that she had glasses on, even as they influence the very way that she sees the world. An important part of Marx's philosophy involves exposing the ideology of capitalism, essentially showing people growing up in capitalist economies how capitalism has influenced everything about their world. So let's start by looking at Marx's materialist conception of history. Marx argued that the material world shapes a human being's ideology. That is, before we have any ideas, philosophies, notions, interests, etc., we have material conditions, including economic conditions. We have to first and foremost get along with other people and the wider environment and make sure that our basic needs are always met. Human societies have structured things so people can survive, and this involves creating a functional economy. It's a fact that people have to work to survive. If you're alone, you have to hunt, make clothes, build shelter, cook food, etc. in order to survive. If you're in a group, the work still needs to be done, but the tasks can be distributed or shared. So economics refers to how such things are managed. Marx argues that the economic structure that ensures our basic needs are met is the foundation for everything else, including politics, laws, religion, philosophy, artwork, and more. Now, in any economic structure, there will be two primary divisions, the oppressed and the oppressors. These manifest themselves differently depending on the economic structure, but they always exist, and their very tension helps guide history and the emergence of new economic systems. As an idealist, Marx thought that the class struggle would end with communism, where the workers would finally become the owners of production. Let's put that aside and consider the case of capitalism. In a capitalist society, the oppressed are known as the proletariat, and they are the workers. They're the employees. We also have the bourgeoisie, who are the owners of capital. They are the entrepreneurs and the business owners. They invest in a company, manage the workers, and profit from the workers' products. Now, Marx describes capitalism as the most efficient economic system in the history of human society, but also the most alienating. He believes that capitalism is alienating to both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and here's why. First, Marx thinks that humans have a certain nature. Specifically, he thinks that people are meant to be producers and we are meant to be social. We like to create things and we like to do it cooperatively. Capitalism as an ideology has fooled us into thinking the exact opposite. For one thing, Capitalism puts people in constant competition. We are pitted against each other. We often feel better about ourselves when we feel we are succeeding over someone else. Just consider spouses who are married and are supposedly in total cooperation with each other, and yet one feels personally threatened when their spouse makes more money than they do. We often hear about husbands experiencing this when their wives make more than them or enjoy more professional success than them. There are plenty of examples of this in literature and cinema. And Marx argues that this goes against human nature, which is to be cooperative. Whether he's right about this or not is debatable. But think about how you feel when you're in a group of non-competitive people and you're doing something meaningful. As a personal example, I volunteer for a community orchard, and I go to monthly work parties and I participate in a coordinating committee. And I personally feel a lot of pride in the orchard, and volunteers just keep coming and coming because they enjoy getting their hands dirty, creating a beautiful space, and doing it in a cooperative environment among friends. Capitalism also normalizes inequality, and particularly financial inequality. We consider it okay that some people are rich and others are poor. Homelessness is a serious social problem, but for capitalists, it's not an intolerable one. If it were intolerable, we would create a home for everyone because we wouldn't be able to function otherwise. And yet we don't, even as the resources to do so are technically available. We cope with this by arguing that in a capitalist society, everyone has an equal chance for success. But this is obviously false. If you have any doubt about this, I recommend you read Amazing Grace by Jonathan Kozol, who spent time in the poorest areas of the South Bronx and documented the lives of children growing up there. He describes overcrowded schools with teachers who have little to no resources, families that deal with depression, drugs, and violence. The odds of a child growing up in this environment and leaving and becoming educated or skilled in a certain job and entering the middle or upper class are incredibly slim. Still, we find those rare exceptions of people who go against the odds, and we satisfy ourselves with the idea that this proves that opportunities are distributed equal for all people in the country. And it helps us cope with the incredible disparity between the rich and the poor in a capitalist society. Marx also argued that a human's productive life under capitalism is alienating and unsatisfying. For one, the employee works for the business owner and hands over all the products of his or her labor at the end of the day. In other words, the worker receives money for labor, but nothing tangible, no ownership over the product of his or her labor. Employers pay workers less than the value of what they produce as well. Employers also they pay workers the least amount that they can get away with. And even when an employee negotiates a high wage, the employer will always offer a salary that is less than the amount of money that the person will be worth to the company. In other words, the owners of the company require that the company is profitable. And to make that happen, the owners of the company require that and to make that happen, they need to pay their workers less than the revenue that they help to produce. Unless there is a profit-sharing system happening, the workers will not benefit from the profit themselves and will own nothing of the products they create. Marx also argues that the worker is alienated from the process of making goods. The more efficient a company is, the more specialized someone's job will be, and the less training that they'll require. Marx is reacting to capitalism's factory worker system, where workers essentially become cogs in a big machine, doing a repetitive and simple task that requires little to no training. By engaging unskilled workers and getting them to be efficient at one small part of a larger process, you maximize efficiency and profits. And Marx argues that this is unsatisfying work. Now, a lot of factory labor has moved out of the US, but consider this quote from the Wall Street Journal from August 2016 about Foxconn in China, which is a company that mass produces iPhones. And I quote, "Early one day last week, a 31-year-old man finished his night shift on an iPhone assembly line, climbed to the top floor of Foxconn Technology Group's L03 production building, and leapt to his death. He had been on the job for a month." End quote. The simplified labor required of a profitable manufacturer is economically efficient, but it doesn't satisfy the workers as people. Marx argued that capitalism alienates people from their own natures. As noted earlier, Marx conceives of people as being creators and producers, as well as being cooperative. When we sell our labor as a commodity and don't perform our labor as an end in itself or something that's inherently valuable, we go against our nature as a creator and a producer. Consider the difference of pursuing a project because you love it, even as it will not result in money. You do it for its own sake. Now, it would be rare, although not impossible, to find someone who would perform their job even if they weren't getting paid for it. Oftentimes you hear people say that you should keep your passions and your career separate. For instance, it's dangerous for a musician to make a living playing music because there is worry that playing music will become a chore and something that is no longer enjoyable. When we hear such things, it becomes obvious that we have normalized the idea that a job will be unsatisfying. We spend 40 or more hours a week, every week, up until retirement, doing things that we don't expect to be satisfying in the least. Even the bourgeoisie experience this. An entrepreneur who owns a certain company that creates a certain product and sells it over and over and over again. Most entrepreneurs can only be successful if they specialize in a certain market, so it's unlikely or difficult to have much variety in the workplace. So while the entrepreneur can make plenty of money, their dull and repetitive work and focus makes their lives dull as well. Capitalism also alienates people from each other, insofar as we conceive of others as being in constant competition with us. We compete even against the people at work we consider to be friends. For instance, we want to earn larger raises than them or gain more accolades from them, from the bosses. Marx argues that this goes against people's innate desire to be cooperative. Now, I previously compared ideology to glasses that we wear and that color and shape our world. Marx thought that people could become conscious of the ideologies that emerge from the economic systems that ground us, and we can make changes and seek more fulfilling existences. There are plenty of people that would be considered eccentric in our society for having lived in ways that defied the expectations of a good capitalist. Such people are probably non-materialistic, make their living doing things they are passionate about, own the product of their labor to some degree, and live interesting lives. This indicates that it is possible to challenge prevailing ideologies and struggle against economic structures. Presumably, such a person would not be blinded by ideology, but would define meaning and purpose for themselves. Let me know if you have any questions about Marx. We will now turn our attention to Siddhartha Gautama and Buddhism. The life of Siddhartha, who I'll refer to as the Buddha, is part history and part myth. The Buddha takes on a mythic and legendary character. The Buddha was born to the ruler of the Shakya clan, and his father wanted to protect him from suffering, so he kept him quarantined in a palace. When he finally left, he had 4 encounters. First, he encountered a decrepit old man, then a severely ill man, then a corpse being carried away to a funeral, and finally a wandering ascetic. The first three encounters were existential encounters. He faced old age, disease, and death, and realized there's nothing protecting him from these things. Death, sickness, and old age are the great equalizers. Rich or poor, you can end up sick or decrepit, and you will definitely end up as a corpse. The fourth encounter of an ascetic man provided a view of an alternative lifestyle, a glimpse into a spiritual life. And the Buddha took the path of the wandering ascetic in hopes of getting rid of the suffering associated with his desire to avoid decrepitude, disease, and death. Doing so meant he gave up all physical pleasures. He fasted nearly to the point of starvation. He had little to no clothes, bringing him to the brink of being frozen, and he refrained from luxuries. What he found is that he still suffered. In other words, changing your physical conditions won't necessarily help you. Suffering comes from a state of mind. He then gave up his ascetic lifestyle and promoted a middle path that became known as Buddhism. He argued that there are four truths about life and the mind. These are the four noble truths. The first is that all life is sorrowful. The second is that the cause of suffering is ignorant craving. The third is that the suppression of suffering can be achieved. And finally, the way to do so is the Eightfold Path. So how is number one true? Well, everything in life is temporary and fleeting. The Buddha refers to the Indian concept of Maya, that life as it is phenomenally experienced is an illusion. Nothing lasts and nothing is real. You might compare this to René Descartes and his wax example. We think the wax is one way, but it can be another. Any particular form it has is illusory because it changes all its characteristics depending on how warm or cold it is. The truth about the wax is what's underneath. Well, for the Buddha, we are the wax. We are happy one moment and sad the next, then angry, then satisfied, then jealous, and so on and so on. We typically equate these various mental states and feelings with the self. It is I that is happy, and I that is sad, and I that is jealous. But he argues that this is an illusion. We actually don't have much control over our constantly changing mental states. Another Indian term is samsara. All life is constant ending and becoming. Samsara is characterized by suffering because we want to make permanent that which is constantly changing. So here's a quote to think about. The world truly is a torrent of cause and effect with no stability within it, save the stability we try to make for ourselves as a refuge from change and inevitable death. That stability only exacerbates suffering because it is a fictional stability created by our desperate grasping after security. The only real stability, therefore, lies in nirvana, just because nirvana precisely is not the torrent of samsara. So, I feel joy, that comes out of some other feeling, perhaps sadness, and it flows into another feeling, onto infinity. If we conceive of the self as something permanent, this flow from one feeling to the next must be no self, or non-self. According to this argument, any feeling is a source of suffering or sorrow. When we see the impermanence of any particular feeling, we see that even good feelings are a source of suffering because they won't last, but we want them to. Just like all feelings, the good ones are unfortunately fleeting. So we've seen how number one is true, that all life is sorrowful or all life is suffering. But how is number two true? That the cause of suffering is ignorant craving. Well, all that I've been talking about doesn't cause suffering alone. The cause of suffering is the desire or craving for things to be different. For example, we crave that our happiness is not fleeting, that we're not subject to cause and effect and constant impermanence. The root cause of suffering, then, is desire. Regarding Buddha's 4 encounters, we want ourselves and others to live forever, so death causes suffering. We want to be healthy all the time, so sickness causes suffering. We want to be appreciated, so rejection causes suffering. There's always a want or a desire associated with suffering. Now, of course, it could be that we suffer because we're in a lot of pain or we can't just ignore it. But Buddhists believe that the mind has a lot of power. Our mind can shape our physical conditions. So if we can voluntarily accept the small sufferings we experience every day, such as criticism, unpopularity, slander, we are training ourselves, kind of like athletes in training, undergoing small physical distress, to eventually voluntarily accept great sufferings, such as hunger, thirst, disease, physical abuse, and ultimately death. In other words, the more familiar we become with the patient acceptance of suffering, the more the strength of our patience will increase. Now, number 3 of the 4 Noble Truths, the suppression of suffering can be achieved. And this gives us hope. It says we can end suffering by ending this ignorant craving. We can work to stop clinging and desiring. We can train the mind to do so, and we can end our suffering. Such a state of non-suffering is known as nirvana. It can be described as a state of equanimity, no self, and a calmness of mind. It's generally thought to involve non-dualistic thinking. And here's a quote from the Buddha. There is, monks, a domain where there is no earth, no water, no fire, no wind, no sphere of nothingness, no sphere of infinite consciousness, no sphere of neither awareness nor non-awareness. There is not this world, there is not another world, there is no sun or moon. I do not call this coming or going, nor standing nor dying, nor being reborn. It is without support, without occurrence, without object. Just this is the end of suffering. Now, it might sound strange or impossible, but if you meditate enough, you can reach a state of mind where you are fully conscious and aware, and yet you are not distinguishing anything, and you can't even tell where you end and something else begins. Okay, number 4 of the 4 Noble Truths. The way is the Eightfold Path. It argues that the path to non-suffering is the Eightfold Path. All steps in the Eightfold Path are interdependent, mutually supportive, and followed simultaneously. So it's not like number 1 comes before number 2. They're all interdependent and followed at the same time. The first is right view, which means understanding the 4 Noble Truths, understanding the source of suffering, understanding the Buddha's teachings. The second is right intention, which means that we must be motivated to help others and to end suffering. We must be motivated to end our own suffering. The third is right speech, and this involves not harming anyone with our speech. So not lying, not deceiving, not insulting, and so on. A right action involves living virtuously, being kind, being generous, living by virtue. The fifth is right livelihood, which means you don't earn a living in a way that causes harm to others or to the world. Okay, these 3, 4, and 5 are really where ethics comes into play with Buddhism, and the whole goal here is to end suffering. So the last thing you want is to do things in life that create feelings of guilt or remorse. Okay, so by living virtuously, you can have a clean, clear conscience. And this is very similar to Socrates' argument that doing good helps the doer, and living in vice harms the doer, even when you get what you ultimately want. Okay, number 6 is right effort, which means intending to prevent unwholesome states of mind. Right concentration, which refers to developing the skills of mental concentration through meditation. So taking up a practice of meditation, sitting quietly, studying your mind. And then last is right meditation, which refers to living mindfully and being mentally astute and controlled. Mindfulness occurs at all times. You're aware of what's going on. You're aware of how you're feeling about it. You're aware of the thoughts and feelings and emotions that are going through your mind and the sort of impermanence of them, and so on. So the Eightfold Path is designed to keep you motivated to end suffering, which is where 1 and 2 come into play. It will develop your virtues so that you'll be acting in ways that make you feel, that ensure you don't feel guilt or remorse, and that's through 3, 4, and 5. And it will give you a path to follow, things that you can actively do to help along the process, which is where 6, 7, and 8 come in. Now, this process takes a long time. We have to completely rewire our brain and all its natural habits in order to get beyond desire and suffering. There's a story where the current Dalai Lama was asked by a student of Buddhism for the quickest way to attain enlightenment. He thought about it for a long while and then he just started to cry. And the reason is that the Buddha does not offer a quick fix. The Eightfold Path is not a made-for-TV kind of product. It takes a lifetime. And to go at it desiring a quick fix already means that you're deeply enslaved to your desires. So this will conclude my lecture for the week and the final lecture for the class. As always, don't hesitate to email me questions. I want to reemphasize that I've appreciated this class and the effort and insight you've provided.